It was difficult to tell what she was thinking about the situation. The fact that her friend had referred to Steve as this bad guy, then seemed to be involved with him, had to have perplexed her. She was only about 13 after all. The girls never spoke about that again. It's recounted that Steve abruptly stopped raping Jane Doe once the 8th grade was over, but one of the last horrible things she said he did was to bring a group of friends to her house so they could rape her as well. This was all seen in a different way in the mid-1980s than we see it now. Rape was not even a term that was used to describe this situation. Sadly, but more in line with the times, Jane gained an unsavory reputation as a result of Steve's abuse. That awkward day is Tina Faelz and Steve Carlson's first known interaction. They'd next be seen screaming at each other at school, and speculation was that it had to do with Jane Doe. I mean, at this point, it just wasn't a secret anymore, but at the same time, it didn't seem to be a huge deal either. Tina was at the same time dealing with constant issues with some girls from her neighborhood. By early spring 1984, she was taking the shortcut through the creek all the time, whenever her mother wasn't available. Murderous Minors is brought to you by Best Fiends. Now is a great time to fall in love with Best Fiends, and you definitely won't regret it. Summer has never looked more fun. With monthly updates and new levels and events, there's often something new and adorable to brighten my spirits. I'm not gonna lie, I got stuck on a few levels not too long ago, but I'm happy to report that my slump is over. Best Fiends is such a unique and exciting puzzle game. It's just unlike other puzzle games out there. I download games that I see in Best Fiends ads, but they hardly live up to the creative and intriguing game I already adore. Anytime I need a change of pace as one day blends into the next, I check in with Best Fiends. Best Fiends has thousands of levels already, with new levels, events, and characters added every month. It's hours of fun right at your fingertips, and you can even play offline. With over 100 million downloads and tons of 5-star reviews, Best Fiends is a must-play. Download Best Fiends free on the Apple Store or Google Play. That's friends without the R. Best Fiends. The bus stop and the bus ride itself put her right in the crosshairs of her bullies, and kids would throw rocks at her and nicknamed her Tuna. On April 5, 1984, Shirley Faelz drove her kids to school as the calendar ticked toward spring break. Steve Carlson called in sick to school that day but showed up drunk on campus and drank more with some friends anyway. By mid-morning, he was totally trashed and had been trapped inside a dumpster by a football player he was trying to start a fight with. It was the woodshop teacher who freed him, the same teacher who'd stopped the vicious beatdown Steve was giving another student in the hall earlier in the year. He and many other teachers and administrators saw Steve leave campus heading toward his house. Lunch brought nothing but teasing for Tina, as she had rocks thrown at her amid taunts of "Hey Tina the Tuna." Girls threatened to beat her up after school, so she skipped the detention she'd been assigned for being tardy because some of those girls were supposed to be there too, and waited approximately half an hour before heading home, planning to traverse her usual route via the creek shortcut. Another freshman was just behind her until their paths split with a quick goodbye. There was a second freshman boy, Tina's neighbor, walking in the direction of their homes before jumping in a car with friends. He saw her get as far as Steve's Street, Lemonwood Way, where the Carlson house sat adjacent to the entrance to the creek. A different boy recalled seeing Tina approaching the shortcut home and Steve in his front yard at the same time, though over the ensuing years, recollections would shrink and grow. Were they on a motorbike? He couldn't entirely be sure, and left then to get picked up by his mom. The fact is that within the next 5 to 15 minutes or so, 14-year-old Tina Faelz was brutally murdered. She'd skipped detention and was last seen alive by that student at 3 p.m. when he went back to the school to meet his mom. Her autopsy would identify 44 cut and stab wounds to the young girl's body, in addition to multiple bruises and scrapes. There was no evidence of sexual assault, and her belongings were there, scattered around Tina's bloody body. Her purse was found thrown up in a tree. Several students encountered Tina lying face down at the start of the shortcut, some thinking she couldn't be real. Quickly, investigators had several leads they felt were viable to start off the investigation with. There was community suspicion surrounding the truck driver who saw the body from the freeway and called 911 at 3:27 p.m. Once the timeline of his recollection of the day proved sound, he was removed from suspicion. Then there was Tina's mom's boyfriend, and not only him, but his friend as well. Detectives had particular interest in each of them for various reasons, one being that they felt Tina knew her killer. This didn't feel like a random murder by a stranger to police. Tina's dad felt that a renter could be responsible, which helped direct focus toward the boyfriend's friend. But their alibis checked out. It wasn't them either. It seemed that Tina had been murdered with an average-sized pocket knife with a very sharp blade. An immediate canvass of the area began, and a group of teenagers were observed watching the investigation from the roof of the Carlson home. Upon hearing of the murder just yards from their house, Mr. and Mrs. Carlson opted to leave their kids unattended for one more evening and return home the next day. It was initially thought that the residents of that home had been spoken to, however, they soon realized that wasn't the case. Consequently, the freshman who lived in the house closest to where another freshman was just murdered was interviewed for the first time 2 days later. Through the scores of Foothill students already interviewed, they'd caught wind of the fact that Steve had called out sick but had shown up drunk to school anyway. There were no cuts to his hands like would be expected of this killer, and Steve acted normal, leaving about 30 minutes later. After speaking with the assistant principal that night, detectives decided to speak with Steve again and do so 4 days later. They also talked to the owner of that motorbike who was around at the time Tina was last seen alive, because he'd given inconsistent statements in the days prior. Steve said that he and this guy had been together at several points throughout the day, including before and when Tina's body was discovered. No one was of interest per se, it was just noticed that his stories didn't match. Police had already followed multiple leads and had no suspects. Though creepy Carlson mentioned being with a bunch of different guys that afternoon, none of the kids who came upon the crime scene that day mentioned him at all. They figured there was no reason to be overly suspicious about that, and cops thought more about the kid with the changing story, if anyone. Almost immediately, talk among students began to center on Steve, and he would soon start joking that he did do it, mostly when partying. He'd follow it up with a "just kidding," but a lot of the other kids already thought he was a good suspect, so his comments only fueled their assumptions. The crime lab was testing evidence from the scene and found nothing foreign or of interest at the time. Tina Faelz was laid to rest, and her family and friends mourned, no answers to the multitude of questions they had, and life marched ahead with no suspects in the case. Steve continued school at Foothill High and was an even worse student than before Tina's murder. A few teachers he knew voiced suspicions about his possible involvement, but nothing came of it. Steve continued to abuse drugs and alcohol and eventually moved to an alternative high school where he was known as the guy who'd probably killed that girl, and he bloated from the attention. Soon he found himself in juvenile detention, basically for armed robbery, where he buffed up and got in as many fights as he could. On the outside, police were finally taking these rumors of Steve's statements seriously, and they interviewed some local teens before speaking to him in lockup. Basically, he said he was joking about being the killer and couldn't recall specifics. He said he did own a pocket knife back then, but didn't have it anymore. Police had never found the murder weapon and were back to square one. They pulled out evidence including Tina's purse and searched for prints, of which they found none, and it was returned to evidence 2 years after Tina's murder. Local authorities attempted to connect the cases of other missing and murdered girls to the Faelz case, but that never turned over any links to the Pleasanton murder. Steve Carlson got out of juvie but was back and forth after that, never completing high school. He moved an hour away to his grandma's in Davis and started dating a high school senior in 1988 when he was 21. They shot up together and Steve drank constantly. In 1989, he was convicted of lewd and lascivious acts on a child after getting a 13-year-old girl alone behind a building on the campus of UC Davis. He got 2 years and would be required to register as a sex offender. Steve's girlfriend stood by him and they married while he was incarcerated. He got out in mid-1992 and the couple had a daughter a year later. He was loud, often drunk, sometimes belligerent, and an overall menace. Crank continued to be his drug of choice, and as addicts often do, Steve stole from friends and loved ones. He wrecked everything he and his wife had, including cars and apartments. The couple divorced in 1996, and he had gotten an 18-year-old neighbor pregnant within months. His drug use only escalated, and she was done with his nonsense and inability to change for his child soon after their son's birth in early 1997. She was left to struggle and care for their child alone at the age of 19, while this man, a decade older, could just live his life as he pleased, not even caring about the welfare of his 2 children. And he did. Well, maybe he lived as his addictions pleased, but he didn't help support his children and did more time in jail, including a 3-year sentence for never having registered as a sex offender. His ex-wife and the mother of his daughter passed away while he was in jail, and he was released again the following year in 2008. His daughter was raised by her maternal grandmother, and Steve saw her last when she was 11. He was released for the final time of 2008, just weeks after the anniversary of Tina's murder 24 years prior. An article online commemorating the event yielded multiple comments mentioning Steve Carlson's probable involvement. After almost a quarter century, former Foothill High students had held on to their gut feelings. Around the same time, a detective began looking into some cold cases while pregnant and on less physically demanding duty. One of them was the Tina Faelz murder, and it was now 2008, and technology had advanced greatly since the last testing was conducted back in the 80s. At the end of 2008, the evidence was ready to be retested. In August of 2010, it finally was. After some retesting and double-checking, a male DNA profile was ultimately identified on November 15, 2010. Just weeks later, Steve Carlson, now living on the streets of Santa Cruz, California, was arrested for violating probation, and his DNA was entered into CODIS. 3 months later, the system made a tentative match between the purse and Steve Carlson, just under 2.5 years after the detective sent it to the FBI. Although it wasn't enough to scoop up Steve, police could, however, reopen the case. He'd been locked up ever since he gave that DNA sample and was set to be released in a few